Hello, everyone. Oh, sorry about that. Hello, everyone. Jacquie Edwards here. Yeah, I wanted to jump on today to talk about contracts for your rent-to-rent business. I've been getting loads of questions and queries about contracts. I had done a blog article previously a couple of years ago now. So I just wanted to kind of update that. There haven't really been any changes, but just give you a bit more information about your contracts, what you should be thinking of with your rent-to-rent contracts, the different types of contracts, and where you can get your contracts from. So I will just give it a minute for some people to come online. Let me just look at my screen and see what's happening. Yep, I can see we've got a few people live. I'm using some new software, so bear with me if it kind of gets a bit confusing. If you see people commenting at all that they can't see the video, tell them to refresh their screen because that tends to work. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining me on this lovely Wednesday after a long bank holiday weekend. I had a wonderful weekend. I cleaned my house basically. So I've read the book, I think it was called The Magical Art of Tidying, and basically decided to completely tidy my house. So I've been getting rid of pretty much everything. After this, I'm going to the tip to get rid of hopefully what is the last bit of stuff. And then I am almost done and my house looks so much nicer. I've gotten rid of so much stuff. My kitchen is amazing. I've gotten rid of pretty much everything on the countertops. Absolutely wonderful. So if you haven't tried decluttering and tidying, highly recommended. My life feels a lot better, especially since I spend all day working from home. So let's see, we've got a few people on. It's a couple minutes past 11. I know most people can't make it because it's kind of the middle of the day. So anyways, let's talk about rent-to-rent contracts. And if you're not here live, you can catch up later. Hopefully you can all hear me. I'm assuming that you can because nobody said, hey, we can't hear you. So thank you for joining me. Let's talk rent-to-rent contracts. Now, there are, first of all, what kind of contracts should we be using? There's a couple of different kinds of contracts. Now, the two that you should be focusing on are either a management agreement or a commercial lease agreement. Now, these do have different names. So a management agreement is like the type of agreement that a normal letting agent uses. Basically just says you, rent-to-renter, are managing the property on behalf of the owner. So you're just acting as that management agent. The commercial lease agreement, I think it can also be called like a non-housing act agreement, or there's quite a few different names. This is basically your subletting agreement. So this is basically saying you, the rent-to-renter, are leasing the property from the owner, and then you are subletting the property to your tenants. So that's the kind of basic sublet arrangement. So those are the two types of contracts that you should be focusing on in your rent-to-rent business. Other people I have seen, they will use maybe an AST or your assured short hold tenancy agreements. People do use those. It's technically not the right kind of agreement that you should be using because these are for your end tenants, basically. So an AST is a Housing Act agreement that is for whoever is living in that property. So technically for you as the rent-to-renter, this isn't the type of agreement that you should be using. Now, there are rent-to-renters out there that do use this kind of agreement. It can be a lot easier because, you know, your letting agents know what it is, lots of property owners know what it is, and they're comfortable with that agreement. So people will use that, review it, maybe take out the subletting clause and any other clauses that don't quite fit with your rent-to-rent and use that agreement. Another agreement that people tend to use is a company-let agreement. Now, the standard company-let agreement basically says you, company XYZ, are renting this property in order to house your employees. Now, as a rent-to-renter, you're likely not going to be housing your employees in all of these properties. So this really isn't the right kind of contract to use, again, unless you are modifying it and editing that contract. Again, the company-let agreement is something that a lot of people know what they are. So your letting agents and your property owners know what a company-led agreement is. So they'll be more comfortable using it, but it's really not the right kind of agreement. But there are people that use them. I'd say as long as you make the modifications, you could be okay if you're comfortable with that. But really, any contract is a contract. So we don't even need to have a paper contract. We could just say, hey, I agree to rent your house. I'm going to pay you £1,000 a month, shake hands on it, and that's a contract. Now, the problem with that as a contract is it's kind of hard to prove because it turns into kind of a he said, she said problem if there's anything that happens down the line. So it's hard to kind of have a whole bunch of witnesses. It's easier if things are written down. And then as long as it's written down and, kind of reasonable people can understand it, you've got a contract, so it can say whatever you want it to say. But if there is a problem down the line and, the owner all of a sudden wants the property back and you have a disagreement, that contract is what's going to be gone to kind of solve any problems. Now, having it in the right legal format, if it ever gets to kind of a judge, will help your case in any kind of a legal contract or legal contest. So that's why it's important to try to get the best contract for your situation and make sure that you're covering kind of any of the future eventualities that might occur. So a contract, while everything is going great, is fine. You just stick it in a drawer and you don't need to worry about it. The contract really tends to only come into play when there's a problem at some point in the future. So that's what you want to protect yourself against, is kind of any of those problems that might arise in the future. So theoretically, you should be using either the management agreement or the commercial lease agreement. And there's specific instances when you should use either one of those. So Matt's had a quick question that says, do you need both those two contracts together back to back? You don't need them both. I'd say it's good to have them both, but you wouldn't use both of them in the same transaction. So you'd use one or the other contract with a certain deal. But I suggest you have both of them because the commercial lease agreement is used in different situations than the management agreement. So the management agreement, if you're just going to get one type of contract, I'd get a management agreement because that can be used on any rent-to-rent contract. It's open, it's flexible, it's understood by kind of the community at large. So your mortgage lenders will know what a management agreement is because, again, it's used by letting agents. More of your solicitors and lawyers and judges will understand a management agreement. Generally your property owners will be a bit more comfortable using a management agreement as well. It's just more common in the industry, and your rent-to-rent one will be tailored to your deal and your time frames and how you're managing your business. But the kind of base contract is just a management agreement, which are pretty standard. The commercial lease agreement, on the other hand, should only be used when the property doesn't have a mortgage. So the commercial lease agreement is subletting. So again, you are renting the property from the owner in order to sublet it to your end tenants. Now, again, that's completely legal. There are no UK laws against subletting. So as long as you've got the right contract in place and you've told the owner what you're doing, it's fine, as long as he doesn't have any terms in any of his previous contracts that prohibit subletting. And most mortgage contracts will have a clause that say no subletting is allowed. And that's why you would need to use a management agreement if the owner has a mortgage on their property. But if the owner does not have a mortgage on their property, I'd recommend trying to use your commercial lease agreement. It's the agreement that I lead all of my deals with. So when I go to meet an owner or an agent, I give them a little information pack. That information pack has a draft copy of my commercial lease agreement. And I say, this is our contract. And they are required to kind of read all the terms and conditions and make sure it's suitable for them. So it's not suitable if they've got a mortgage in place. And I would talk to them and say, all right, you need to make sure everything is okay with your mortgage company. And that's a whole other conversation. You don't want to get into too much detail about mortgages unless you're a mortgage broker, which I'm going to assume most of you are not mortgage brokers. It is kind of a regulated industry. So be really careful getting into giving them mortgage advice. If they've got questions about mortgages and how it works, give them, a referral to a mortgage broker, or tell them to talk to their mortgage broker, and kind of push that back on them because you can't give mortgage advice. You want to be really careful about that. So, so commercial lease agreement, if they don't have a mortgage, is great because there are better tax consequences, basically. And I won't go into loads of details about that because I'm not a qualified tax accountant, so you should speak to your accountant about that. But right now, it's a lot better. Whereas with the management agreement, once you get above the VAT threshold, you will be required to register for VAT and pay VAT on your income. So I've got a couple of other questions that have come in. I'll just pop through those. So can you have a contract with the estate agent, and what type will it be? I'd say you wouldn't have a contract in most normal cases with your estate or your letting agent. Your contract will always be with the property owner. So the letting agent or the estate agent will kind of act as the middleman between you two. So the estate agent or the letting agent, I'll call them the letting agent, will have a contract with the owner. So their contract, they will have a management agreement with the owner, or they might have a let only agreement. So their contract will be with the owner. They've got a management agreement. It'll say, the owner will pay the agent 10% commission or whatever. So in that situation, you would still sign whatever contract is suitable directly with the owner. The agent stays in place, and how it works for me in my business is I am just like any other tenant when there's an agent in place. So I pay my £1,000 every month. I pay that to the agent. So the agent collects the money. They take their 10% commission out, and they put that in their pocket. So they take their £100 and they pass the rest on to the property owner, just like they would in any other kind of rental situation with, Mr. and Mrs. Smith renting the property. So you don't need to have a contract with the agent unless you have some other kind of more complicated side deal with them where you agree to pay them a set amount of commission or a set fee, like a sorcerer's fee for every deal that they bring to you. Then you would want to have a separate contract with them. But in your normal rent-to-rent situation, just think of yourself as kind of the normal tenant. And what would that agent do in a normal tenancy deal? You would sign the contract, they would take the money and their fee would come out of that. And you don't need to worry about how it works after that with the agent. That's their business. But you should make sure that your contract is signed by the property owner directly, just to make sure that you've got them aware of everything they need to know and you know that they've read your contract. And if there's no mortgage, yes, if there's no mortgage, you can still use the management contract. So a management agreement can be used for any transaction. That's why I said, if you just want to have one contract that you can use for everything, use the management agreement, and you can just tweak that a little bit for each and every deal that you've got, because whether they've got a mortgage or no mortgage, you can use a management agreement. It's nice and simple and easy. All right, so those are the two key kinds of contracts that you should be using. Now, I should always recommend that you have your contracts written by a solicitor. So every deal is kind of its own individual deal. Even though in my business, I try to be standard in pretty much everything. So I always use pretty much the same contract. I always have the same terms and condition. I always take on all of the kind of internal non-structural maintenance. My deals are all structured the same. The only things that tend to change are kind of our monthly rental fee. Really, that's it, kind of the start date and the end date. So those are the only things that really change. But if you're doing anything more complicated than that, then you could have a lot more terms changing in your contracts. So what I do is I've got one contract that I use and I just edit it myself. And I just make whatever changes I need to make because I feel comfortable doing that. Again, the best way to do it is have your solicitor make those changes, have your solicitor review everything to make sure that everything is kind of all wrapped up in a nice, neat package and that you're protected. And when your solicitor writes your contract, you are protected if anything is wrong in that contract. So if, 3 years down the line, the landlord's like, this is an illegal contract, I want my property back, I'm suing you, you can go back to your solicitor and they'll either help you sort that out, or if it really was incorrect, you can sue them and claim on their professional indemnity insurance. Whereas if you get your contract from anywhere else, or if you do the writing and tweaking, you don't really have anything to fall back on. You'll have to kind of support yourself. You can hire a solicitor to help support you and all of that, but there is that little bit higher level of risk. So when you're deciding where you're getting your contract from or who's putting your contract together, or if you're going to tweak it or have somebody else tweak it, it all depends on your level of risk with your deal. Now, I only try to work with landlords that I have a good relationship with and that I trust. I have told landlords no in the past because they weren't people that I wanted to be in a 5-year business relationship with. I think of my landlords as my joint venture partners. I want to make sure they're people that I trust in the long term. So if you're already thinking at the outset, well, I need to make sure my contract is, super duper watertight because, that guy's a little bit shady and I'm worried about what he's going to do in the future, then you probably shouldn't be getting into that deal with that landlord. Or if you're worried about him not paying his mortgage payments, or not being able to pay them, or just willfully not paying them, then you might really want to reconsider if that's the right deal for you or not, because this is a long-term business arrangement. You want to be in it with people that you trust and that you want to work with over the long term. So for me, I don't see myself editing the contracts as being a huge risk. I don't see myself kind of putting together my contract for each deal without a solicitor as a huge risk for me, because I feel confident and comfortable doing that. I feel confident and comfortable with my property owners. We've got a good relationship before we get to the contract signing stage. So, but the ideal situation is that you have your solicitor write each and every contract and tailor it for each and every deal. So let's see what other questions we've had come up. Do you pay your landlord or your estate agent upfront or in arrears? I always pay upfront. So again, just like any other tenant, you expect them to pay the rent on the first of the month for that kind of following month. I pay all of my landlords or the agents upfront. I collect the rent from my tenants a couple days earlier than that, so they're kind of rental collection period is, I think, the 27th of the month. So it's normally in my bank account on or before the 1st of the month. And my payments to my landlords go out on the 1st of the month. So that way I've collected their rent in advance and my landlords are paid in advance. And how can you guarantee the rent as they're used to doing tenant checks? It's being really confident about what your business is. So we won't go into loads of detail on this, but it's just, you're a business owner now. So it's like any business can kind of guarantee it's staying in business or it's providing its products and services. You have researched your area, you know your business model, you know your tenants, you know your clients. You're just confident about, this is my business, this is what I do. I work with, my business is, I'm a relocation agent. I work with companies in the local area to help house their employees. We do this by taking your property on a long-term contract. We put our clients in individual rooms and rent them out that way. So that's how I explain it to my people or my potential clients. And as long as you can do that confidently as a business would, there aren't going to be loads and loads of questions about how are you guaranteeing rent. It's just, that's what my business is. I always have the rent because otherwise my business wouldn't be any good. And again, that's why you have a contract, because there's always the question, I pretty much always get this from my property owners, of what happens if my company goes into administration or bankruptcy. And they've got other questions as well. A lot of those questions are answered in your contract. So my kind of standard terms and conditions have clauses about what happens if I go into bankruptcy, what happens if I go into administration, what happens if I'm late paying the rent, so it has interest clauses and penalty charges. So all of that is spelled out in the contract, which is why I give them a copy of that at the first meeting. I give them a draft copy. And so that's one of the questions, is an information pack for the homeowners is a great idea. What do you include in that information pack? It's pretty simple. I've got a one-page document with a little bit of information about who we are. So it's kind of, who is Jade Property Solutions. I've got a page called What is a Commercial Lease? So that's my, that's what I call rent to rent when I'm working with owners and agents. I call it a commercial lease because nobody knows what rent to rent is. Or if they do, it's got kind of a bad name in the industry. So I call it just a commercial lease. And I've got another page that's called What is Rent to Buy? And that's what I call a lease option. Now, I don't always use that anymore, but we won't go into details about that. But yeah, so those are basically just FAQ pages with some frequently asked questions on them. And then I include a draft copy of my commercial lease agreement so that they can go home and they can read through this information and they can share it with their spouse. Or if it's the agent, they've got that information there to be able to answer the property owner's questions in my words. So I don't have to worry about them making stuff up or trying to remember what we talked about and how it all works. They've got it right there in front of them. And when the owner says, well, how does it work? He can just read, well, this is what they do. This is what their business is. This is how it works. So that's what I include in my information pack. I find it quite helpful because a lot of people need more information. They're not just going to give you their biggest asset on kind of a smile and a handshake of meeting at the first time at the property. So I find giving them that pack with the contract answers a lot of their questions, and then I don't need to go into lots of detail about it, because personally I'm not good at explaining things kind of one-to-one in that situation. I'm not a great negotiator. I do get nervous still talking to property owners and negotiating deals, so having that there, that they can read through it, and then I know I don't have to try to explain what's already written in the contract. They'll know the answers to those questions. So that's a good reason to have your contract up front. So before you even get started or before you do these deals, it's really good to have kind of an example contract so that you can read through it and get an understanding of it. Because when I first started, I didn't really know. I mean, I kind of knew how it worked. I didn't have any property experience. I got the basic gist of this is how rent to rent works and what I'll be doing. But I did have, owners and agents ask me questions that I didn't quite know the answer to. But once I got my kind of template contract put together, then I was like, now I understand this is how it works. Here's the answers to most of the questions that they were asking me. So that really helped clear it up in my head, how rent to rent worked, what happens if, the owner doesn't pay, or if I don't pay, or what happens in different situations. It covers who does maintenance, and that kind of thing, so that you don't have to think about it in your head. That's another thing I would really suggest, is having that standard contract, because most owners are used to a letting agent, and a letting agent doesn't have kind of an open piece of paper as your contract. You go to them, they've got their standard terms and conditions. If you want to work with that letting agent, you sign their standard terms and conditions. There's not a whole bunch of back and forth and negotiating. Whereas if you go to the property owner and you're like, this contract can be anything you want it to be. Oh, we can make it for 3 years or 7 years, or we can do the maintenance, or you can do the maintenance, or we can pay for this, or you can pay for this. It's whatever you want it to be. Then they start thinking, well, this sounds a little bit shady. This is all too confusing, too complex. I've got too many options. It's all too hard, and they go away. Whereas if you give them, here are our standard terms. Here's who pays the maintenance. So you could pay all the maintenance, or you could say, we'll pay the first £100 of maintenance. Just write it in there as a clause. And what other stuff? Make sure you write who's responsible for utilities, that type of thing. My contracts tend to be a standard 5-year term, so I write that directly in kind of my draft blank version of my contract. So here's our set way of business, and then just leaving a couple things that you can negotiate on, I find makes it a lot easier, because most people want to be told what to do. They don't want to have to decide on 8 million things. They want their life to be easier. So for you to make their life easier, just here's our standard terms and conditions. You can read through this. If you've got questions, let me know. Otherwise, let me know when you're ready to sign the contract. So that's the way I do it, and I recommend, and I find it's easiest for my property owners, because they don't have to think about it. They don't have to make loads of decisions. They can just get on with it. So having that contract ahead of time really helped me to understand my business, understand how to explain it to property owners, and how to answer the questions that they had for me. So Meldon, is it possible to have rent-to-rent deals through an agency? Yes, it's totally possible. I've got some through agents, and I know other people that's their whole business model. It can be quite a good way of doing things, especially if you don't have loads of time. So instead of you going out and finding direct to landlords and doing loads of advertising and doing lots of direct letter mailing and just pounding the pavement, basically, you can build up a good relationship with an agent, and they'll basically act as your sourcer. It takes a bit more time, because they have to get to know, like, and trust you. They're not just going to pass over their client to somebody that they don't know and have never heard of and has never proven themselves. But if you can build up that relationship, prove that you know what you're doing, then it's easy for them. They can just pass you deals that they know will work for you, and they collect their fee, you collect your fee, the owner has a property that's well managed, everybody's happy. So it's definitely a good way to work your business and build it up, if you're able to build up those relationships. So Armadeep, how much does a management contract and commercial lease agreement cost on average? Great question. So if you're going to a solicitor, I think I was paying £500 per contract plus VAT. So that would be if you wanted a management agreement, it was about £500, maybe $450 plus VAT, and the same for your management agreement, $450 to $500 plus VAT. Some might be more. If you're doing some really crazy complex stuff, your contracts might be more. I think we did a lease option, and it ended up closer to probably £1,000. But I've got some contracts available, so I'll just post that link up there. I don't know how to post in the comments from here, but you should be able to see the link. I've got some contracts available technically for educational purposes that you can have a look at. These are like the contracts that I use. So I've got a management agreement and a commercial lease agreement. They're available for £197 for the two of them together. And it's basically Word document templates. So it's got my little comments in there too. So with notes about here's what you should consider, here's where you change stuff, here's what you need to edit, that you can kind of build your contracts from that. So check out my website. Those are available there now. And again, so they're £197 for the two contracts versus, £500 each, so £1,000 from your solicitor. If it is quite a complicated deal, you may want to speak to a solicitor just to make sure you've kind of covered everything. But for your basic straightforward deal, as long as you're confident in kind of reading through a document, making sure the average person understands it, you should be fine to go from there. So do you get the landlord to pay for charges in the house, changes in the house, fire doors, alarms? It depends on the deal. So every deal for me is a little bit different that way. Normally, my landlords don't have the cash up front, so their properties are in not the greatest condition because they don't have the money to do those changes. So I'm the one that does them. There's my doorbell. I think that's my new flower delivery. So I tend to pay for the costs up front, which means I pay them a lower monthly rent as a result. So that's most of the time what I do. If they want a higher rent, so that's what I'll go in offering. So again, I've got my standard terms and conditions saying we pay for everything. I'll go in and say, okay, well, I can pay you £800 a month. And they're like, oh, that's really low. That's a lot lower than market rent. And I say, well, that's because I'm paying for all these fire doors. I'm upgrading your alarm system. I'm repainting your house. By the end of this, your house is going to be worth a lot more money because I'm putting all of this money into it. And I also tell them, usually I don't get any profit until about 2 years into the deal. So I don't make any money. But if you want to get paid more rent, then maybe you can pay some of these costs up front. And most of the time they're like, no, we're fine with that. But if they are, I have had situations. We did a garage conversion once, and the owner basically said, I don't care about the value of the house. We never plan on selling this property. This is, part of our pension. We're going to pass this down to our children. This was my wife's parents' old house. We're not ever selling it. We don't care about the value. We want more rent money now. So I said, all right, well, then you're going to have to pay for part of the conversion. So we ended up splitting the cost of the conversion. They got a little boost in rent, and I got a big boost in rent. So it worked out that way. So it's just kind of seeing what the owner's situation is and what they're happy with. But I always lead with, I pay for everything and we pay a lower rent as a result. If you don't have a lot of starting capital, then you might want to go the other way. So you can say, all right, our terms of business are you need to get your house into the condition that we need it in. We can take care of everything. So for the next 5 years, you won't have to do anything. Life is going to be super simple for you. But in order to get started, you need to put these fire doors in and these fire alarms in, and then we'll be ready to go. And then we can pay you £1,000 a month. So you might be able to pay them that little bit extra and they'll do the work up front. So it's whatever works for both you and the owner. All right, so I'm getting some other questions. We really wanted to just focus on contracts on this call. So if you've got any questions on rent-to-rent contracts, let me know, and then I'll answer Lucas's question really quick. But if you've got other rent-to-rent questions, pop them. I've got the rent-to-rent in the UK Facebook group, so pop over there and post any other questions you've got about non-contract type stuff. So the best way to find a rent-to-rent deal, there's loads of different ways. There's probably no best way for kind of everybody. It's going to depend on your personality, how much time you have, what your area is like. So for me, the best thing that I did was send letters to the list of licensed HMOs. So I got my list of licensed HMOs from my local council, and I sent direct letters to the owners. I also had an ad in the newspaper basically saying, attention landlords, we can guarantee your rent. And that's how we got our first deal. Also, I spent a lot of time with agents. We didn't get loads of deals through agents, but it was a great way for me to practice what I was saying, what my service was, and how I was explaining myself. Again, I know a lot of other rent-to-renters that they've got most or all of theirs through agents by building up that relationship with one or two agents who just source deals for them consistently. So I'd say try as many ways as you can and find out what works the best for you. All right. So I think I've answered all the questions that I see in there. If you've got questions about contracts, let me know, but a little bit of a summary and recap. You should be using a commercial lease agreement or a management agreement with your property owners. A management agreement can be used with any rent-to-rent deal, whether they've got a mortgage or no mortgage, whether it's a flat, whether it's a house, whether it's whatever it is, you can use a management agreement. So if you want to keep it super simple, use the management agreement. If the property owner doesn't have a mortgage on the property, you can consider using a commercial lease agreement. This has slightly better tax consequences. Ultimately, your income is residential rental income, so you won't end up paying VAT. Right now, the VAT threshold is around £85,000. So if your profit gets to £85,000 a year and you're using management agreements, you will have to register for VAT and start filing VAT returns and paying VAT to the government. But you can't collect VAT from your tenants. So there's a little bit of a shortfall there, and you'll probably end up paying basically a bit more in your expenses. So I try to use a commercial lease agreement whenever possible. If you're really comfortable and confident, you can consider using an AST or a company-let agreement with your property owners. I know people that do that if that's the only way to get the deal over the line, because usually it's because the agent is sticking and saying, no, you have to use our agreement. We'll take out the subletting clause, but you have to use our AST agreement. Then again, depending on the level of risk you're comfortable with and how comfortable and confident you are about that deal, a contract is a contract at the end of the day. You've got a legally binding agreement. It's going to get judged based on kind of what is reasonable. So it's up to you to decide what you're comfortable with. Again, the same thing with, do you need a solicitor to write all of your contracts, or are you comfortable getting a template and making a couple of updates yourself? But no matter what you do, rent to rent is not super scary or super difficult, and don't let what kind of contract you're getting hold you back. Don't let your mindset blocks hold you back. Learn what you need to learn. All of the information is out there. There's loads of YouTube videos. I do loads of videos. I've got training courses, loads of training courses out there. The best place to go is probably my books if you want a cheap way of learning things. My books are available on Amazon. If you search Rent to Rent, you'll be able to see them there. So just get out there and get started. I learned a lot as I went on. Matt says, I think you can charge VAT when you're doing rent to rent for service accommodation. Yes, if you're doing service accommodation, you generally are going to be charging VAT on it anyways, whether you're using a management agreement or a commercial lease agreement. So really good point there, Matt. Just because they aren't considered tenants, so they're not kind of paying you residential rental income, that's more of a business income, and your business services are VATable. Armadi, are there different contracts for different tenants, students, or young professionals? So contracts with your tenants are different altogether. So it doesn't really matter whether they're students or young professionals. It depends on more on like what type of tenant they are, so how they're living in your property. So you'll either be using an AST or an assured short hold tenancy agreement, or a license agreement. I'll do another video on the differences of those. I think I've got a video on my website if you want to check that out. But we're really focusing on the contracts with the property owners in this video. So whether you're doing students or young professionals or LHA or whatever, the type of contract you're using doesn't matter between the different tenant types. It just depends how they're living in and using your property is whether you'll use the license agreement or the AST agreement. All right, so come and check out my contracts if you are interested in grabbing those and getting an idea before you get started on what should be included in your contracts and how to answer questions that are probably coming up quite a bit, whether for you, your agents, or your landlords. A lot of those answers will be in the contract. And it, like it did for me, it really helped clear my mind as to how this all worked and how it all got put together. Otherwise, thank you so much for tuning in with me here today. I am going to cut it off there because I've got to, again, head to the tip and finish tidying up my house, and I'm going to IKEA because the drawers that I wanted have just been sent a text saying that they're in stock now. So thank you for joining me. If you've got any other questions on contracts, you can post them here and I will pop back in and try to answer them in the comment box, or head over to the Rent in the UK Facebook group and post any comments and questions there. So thank you for joining me, and I will see you again next time.